So let's talk a little bit about how we can get our JavaScript code to run on demand, or basically at a different time than on load. Like I mentioned, all the code runs at load time. And so if there's ever any instance where you want to delay the running of code, say for example you got some information from an end user, the input, and you wanted to process it, right? You can't process the information before you've collected it from your user. So there's a couple of things within JavaScript that are really helpful. One of those are functions, and the other things are called events. And both of them are really simple. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about comments, because I'm not a big fan of these pop-up things that keep popping up, particularly with my template preview thing over here. Every time I change something, pop-ups continue to pop up. So what I just showed you here was a comment inside JavaScript. Now it's different than the HTML tag comment that we used last week. This is a single line comment inside JavaScript, and for any of you guys who've done any program before, you'll recognize it as very familiar, because this is a very common way to do comments in many languages. This 2 forward slashes here in the front of anything will comment it out. Anything before this is not commented out, and that's an important thing to remember. But so at the beginning of a line, you put these 2 forward slashes. It comments out everything else till the end of the line. It doesn't comment in the line next to it. If you want to do a multi-line comment, it is done this way. Not that way, this way. And anything in between these two things is going to be commented out. So basically the forward slash asterisk followed by the asterisk, the opposite of what we just did, the reverse, so the asterisk and then the forward slash again, and everything in between is commented out, and you can do a multi-line comment that way. Okay, well let's go ahead and get in and talk a little bit about actions or events. And we're going to do that by introducing or talking a little bit more about an HTML element called a button. And we're going to go ahead and use a button here that's similar to something in our lesson that we've had. And we're going to do a button of type button. And we have a method or an attribute inside of this tag called an onClick. Now that can be it's probably pretty obviously what that is. This button is saying onClick. That's the event that we're talking about. I want something to happen. And in here we've got this text that doesn't mean anything to us right now if we don't know what a function is. And then in between our tag, between the opening and closing tags, we've got some text which provides the label for our button over here. So we want to talk a little bit. So this is our event, right? And in order to call that event, we need some JavaScript to run, and we're going to do that by creating a function real quick. And the function is very simple to create. We're going to do a basic function right now. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the fancier features of functions later on in the semester, but for right now, a function to declare, you start by typing in the word function. That declares that whatever I'm going to create here is a function. You give your function a name, and for now you just do an open parenthesis and a closed parenthesis. We'll talk more about the parentheses later. For now, that's sufficient. And then we're going to have an open curly brace and a closing curly brace. And then it's that's how you basically outline a function. And a function is basically you organizing a chunk of code that will run all at the same time when the name of that function is called. So for us, we're just going to put one thing in here, and we're going to go ahead and do another window alert. So we can say window dot alert, and we're just going to put in here and say cheese. And notice that when I'm moving around this pop-up box, remember before the pop-up box was just kept popping up every time I changed something? That's because the function does something really neat. It still loads and runs when the page is loaded, but because it's a function, it doesn't run until it's called. And there's nowhere in this document that this function is called at runtime when it loads. The only place that this function is called, you'll notice that these match down here. We're saying onClick, run this function. And so on load, there's not an onClick. So basically, we've loaded this function, or we've loaded this page, and I've saved some JavaScript inside of a function that can be called later on. So now, as you've probably guessed by now, if I click this button, we will get the pop-up that says say cheese. And that's a way that you can create chunks of code that will be called when you want them to be called. And that's really powerful, and we'll get a little bit more into that as we go on in the next screencast.